quite yet. Hang on. Here we are. All right. This is a special episode of American Hammers TV. I am very, very pleased to have with me Dr. Charles Korr, who wrote the definitive history of West Ham United. It's even called West Ham United. What's the full title? It's West Ham United.
The Making of a Football Club.
Making of a Football Club. That's right. That's right. And we'll get to this dust jacket a little later on. But the first thing I want to do is mention, as we always do, our friends at Strava Craft Coffee in Denver, who send Tim lots of free coffee to drink, since I don't drink coffee, but Tim does. So check out Strava Craft Coffee. If you go to the link on YouTube, you can find a 15% discount with the code, I think it's Hammers15. Honestly, I don't really remember, but if you really want Strava Craft Coffee to discount, contact us. We'll get it for you. So anyway, Dr. Korr is kind enough to let me call him Chuck, which I really appreciate. And I want to welcome you, Chuck, to the show.
Well, it's not only a pleasure, it's something I've been looking forward to ever since you first broached the subject. There's a rare pleasure in running across somebody who actually is interested in West Ham, although there have been a couple of strange circumstances in St. Louis. I forgot to bring it. I have a little piece of paper. This is when I used to have the vanity plate. It was stuck under my windshield, and it says, Hammers, looks good, little smiley face, and that was it.
You have the vanity plate with you, right? You held. I think before we started recording, you held it up. So yeah, there we go. Tell me up a little bit higher. Oh, that's awesome. That's fantastic.
And I did not have any influence to make the state of Missouri have claret plates for 3 years. It just worked out right.
I was going to say that's just a bonus, right? That's just one of the advantages of living in Missouri. I should mention too, before we get too far into this, you are a professor emeritus, I believe, at University of Missouri St. Louis. So that's your background, and you've been in St. Louis for a long time.
We came here in 1970 to stay for 5 years.
So overstayed that just a little bit. Yeah. But you spent a good number of years, or at least a while, in England in the 70s, researching West Ham. And really, this is just an absolutely remarkable book. And as I've told you before, anybody you run into on a West Ham message board, anybody you run into who's interested in the history of West Ham, if you ask the question, what's the best book ever written about the history of West Ham, it's always this one. It's always your book. I don't think anything else even comes close. It's incredibly comprehensive. I'm going through it a second time here, and it's very dense and deep and comprehensive and genuinely fascinating. So why don't we start? You and I have prepared for this interview a little bit. We talked on the phone a couple of times. Why don't we start with your story of how you came to write a book about West Ham in the first place?
Well, let me just go back to one thing before that.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of what the book is not the normal history of a football club. British Library came out with an incredibly detailed guide to books, articles, etc. about football. And this is comprehensive. There were hundreds, if not thousands. And most of the books got about a sentence or a sentence, 2 sentences. Mine got about 4 or 5. And my favorite line in it was, obviously the reviewer liked it, but he says, towards the end, says, this is a bizarre book. It spends almost no time with what goes on the pitch and all the time. And I thought to myself, yeah, it's exactly what I was trying to do. But the idea, I'm the only academic I know who can delight in having his book called bizarre, because it gets the point across.
Well, it's really interesting because people talk a lot now about the West Ham board, who've been in charge now for, 8 or 10 years. And what's really great about this book to me is, as you mentioned, it's not so much here's what happened in the 1980 FA Cup final or things that most people already know about. This is all about the running of the club, the management of the club, the history of the club, starting really from sort of the boardroom and then going down, whereas I think most histories of football clubs are kind of bottom up from the players up to the top. This is kind of the opposite. And I read through it and I think to myself, there's so much that hasn't changed that people think has, but really hasn't. I don't know. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Well, it's the club used to call itself. It was a family club, that it's supposedly represented the basic nature of the extended East End. I mean, you've
Yeah.
been to Upton Park, you know where it is. Technically, it is not in the East End of London.
Right.
It's in the east of London. It's in the Docklands. That's never stopped anybody from. It is the closest thing the East End has to a club, and the tradition. It was a family club in one respect, and that was for the better part of 60 years, 70 years. Two families ran the club. And from 1905 on. There's always a member of the Kearns family. There's always a member of the Pratt family. And make sure sometime later on, when we're talking about the book, to remind me to talk a bit about Len Kearns, who was the deputy chairman when I was working on the book, but he was the chairman by the time the book came out. It took me roughly 11 years from the time I started to the time I published it. Part of that is sloth. Part of it is I found all kinds of interesting and important things to do other than write, so I could more or less excuse myself the fact that I wasn't getting it done. And you probably have the American edition, the University of Illinois edition.
I'm sure I do. Yeah. I'm
Yeah,
sure I haven't noticed, but I'm sure I do.
the original publisher was Duckworth in London, and Duckworth was virtually the last of the old publishing firms owned by one person.
Hmm.
And there's a man named Colin Haycraft who made enough money out of the firm to stay afloat, and he published the books that he was interested in.
Actually, it is the Duckworth. It is the Duckworth edition.
Oh, that's more power to you. That's
it is. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah.
Colin was a double first from Oxford. Was a South of England real tennis, Henry VIII style tennis champion.
Huh.
And a friend of mine, one of the guy named Bill Fishman, who was the great historian of East London, had a couple of books published by Colin, and he told Colin to take me out to lunch and talk about the book, or what was going to be the book. So we had a delightful long lunch at an Italian restaurant, went back to his office and sort of knocked everything off a desk so I could have some place to lean on. And he went and got some tea, and he came back, and we're starting to have tea, and he said, "Oh, by the way, what name do you write under?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, what name do I put on the contract?" And I said, "Contract?" He said, "Well, you do want me to publish it, don't you, dear boy?" So that's how it got published. I mean, having gone through what it takes to get a university press, to send it out to two readers, to have a third reader involved. It was the first sports book that Colin ever did. And every year or so, I'd either go back to London or I would write him, and I said, "I'm sorry, I haven't gotten him." And finally, I was visiting him the year before the book was finished. And I said, "Colin, I need somebody to just prod me." And I probably use slightly stronger language than that. And he said, "Well, I just don't operate like that. With my authors, they'll get the book to me when it's ready." So I went home, and about 2 months later, I phoned him. And I said, "Colin, I understand that you have very good launch parties." He said, "Well, we're quite proud of them." I said, "Can I have one for the West Ham book?" He said, "Well, will you come over for it?" I said, "Certainly. I want my launch party on the 20th of October. When do you need the manuscript?" And that's how I finally got it finished. He gave me a deadline based on when I wanted a party. And the origin of the book, and this is going to sound like a kind of strange idea for him. As you know, my PhD is in English history. My first book was a study of Oliver Cromwell and his foreign policy. I never had any even vague intention of getting involved with sports as an academic or I'm a big sports fan. I like sports writers, but that's not the way you make a living as a historian.
Right.
The genesis of this is in February of 1972. I got enough money from my university to host a conference, 3-day conference on sport and American society. And I built the conference around two main speakers. Jack Scott, the radical sociologist who had taught the course on sport at Berkeley, and Jackie Robinson.
Oh, wow.
And I got Jackie Robinson to come out. I just wrote him a letter cold and said what it was going to be all about. And he wrote back and asked for virtually, I mean, some piddling sum. And for 2.5 days, I was the host for Jackie Robinson, and they were two of the best days of my life. I saw Robinson play against the Phillies in the first month that he was in the major leagues. My dad insisted on buying good seats so he and I could see Jackie Robinson.
Wow.
And whatever I thought Robinson had become after retirement, that he had calmed down, that he hadn't taken much interest, that the fire was out. It took roughly 30 seconds for him to show me how wrong I was. It was an incredible couple of days. And then Ann, my wife, had a full-time job with the county health department, but she did get to go to the 2 night sessions. And we were driving home one evening, and I asked her what she think. Now, Ann is, to put it mildly, not a sports fan. She understands how much it means to me.
Yes.
And what she said is she thought it was great, but after all, it wasn't about sports. It was about a cultural phenomenon and something that was important to people. And I thought, well, that's exactly what it was supposed to be. And since my work was in England and I was trying to go back there the next summer to continue the research on a book on Charles II, just for the fun of it, the next year, before I went over, I wrote to the secretaries of 12 London clubs that were in the 4 divisions and just said, I'm a professor of history at the University of Missouri St. Louis. I'm interested in doing some research on the relationship between a football club and its local community and the structure of a football club. Could I come see you? Spurs never answered. Millwall never answered. Queens Park Rangers said they were moving their offices, and everybody else said yes. So I think I visited 8 clubs, either 7 or 8 clubs, and talked with the secretaries about what I thought I might do. And then I came home and thought about it, and I realized what I wanted to do was look at London. And you can't do that if you can't live there all the time to do the research every day. So I said, okay, the alternative is let's look at one club. And I had 2 or 3 criteria for which club. One is it had to be a club with a recognizable constituency, and it meant something to that constituency. Well, Arsenal was cosmopolitan, Chelsea was cosmopolitan, Fulham didn't have a community. I really cut it down, ended up with 2 clubs that met my criteria. One was West Ham. The second was Charlton Athletic, which is just south of the Thames. It's almost a mirror image in geography of West Ham.
Right.
And both secretaries there were very interested in it. And they both asked me, what did I want from them? And I said, basically, I want access to your minute books and your financial records from 1895 or 1890 to 1965. And we just left it at that. And the more I thought about it, the more it made a lot more sense to do West Ham United for 2 reasons. One is the extended East End north of the Thames is a much more interesting community than the one south of the Thames. And the second is West Ham had remember, this is roughly a decade after West Ham won the World Cup.
Yes.
And so, by the way, that's why I stopped the book in 1966, because all of football changes when people react to the World Cup. It becomes more glamorous than it had ever been. So anyhow, I contacted the secretary at West Ham, Eddie Chapman, who became a dear friend. I don't know whether the book is dedicated to the August 3rd twins. Eddie Chapman and my wife share the same birth date.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So I talked to Eddie, and again, he said, what do you want? And I told him. He said, well, he'll talk to the chairman. Now, one of the things about the West Ham board, this was Reg Pratt when he was chairman, they are very unwilling to talk to writers, to talk to journalists. They are publicity shy. They are basically, Reg Pratt was wonderful to me. But he is basically a Victorian businessman with a Victorian sense of propriety, a Victorian sense of hierarchy. the best of a Victorian businessman, if you will.
Right.
And Eddie, it was up to Eddie Chapman to basically, I was going to say plead my case, but as Eddie told me, he didn't have to do much pleading. He told Pratt what he thought of me. He told Pratt what he thought of the idea. Pratt told him what he thought of the idea. And I came back the next summer to start working in the minute books at West Ham. I went back the next couple of summers, and it was an interesting place to do research. The minute books were huge folio volumes, and I mean they weighed a ton and a half each of them, and they cleared out space for me. There's a huge table in the middle of the boardroom. That's where they would have the post-match food out, and there's a bar there, and there's an inner room for the directors to host people. Anyhow, they just said, "Here it is. It's yours to use." And Eddie, as he was leaving, pointed to the bar and said, "Feel free." And then he also opened up the cabinet in the director's room, and there was a box of Havana cigars, and he said, "Feel free." And for 2 summers, I think it was just 2 summers in a row, I spent weeks working at Upton Park. And some days I'd have lunch, and some days rather than have lunch, I would just go out and walk on the pitch. Now, I met people years later who would have given various body parts in exchange for the chance just to walk on an empty pitch. It would be me and 2 groundsmen walking around there. And
that's fantastic.
I went back in 1976, 77 academic year. I was on sabbatical. So I think I spent 6 weeks in the autumn and 6 weeks in the spring and summer. Finally got to see a match. Because one of the things that West Ham did for me, and this goes right up to the point of when the current owners took over, they offered me what they called hospitality, which meant tickets to any home match I wanted. And they always, Eddie Chapman made it a point to say, "Now you don't want to be lonely, so make sure to bring somebody with you." So there'd be a couple, or if it was somebody, if a married couple, friends of mine were visiting London, "Eddie, could I get 3 tickets?" And he never said no. I mean, I made it a point not to ask for very much, and the hospitality included pre-match lunch or pre-match dinner if it was an evening match, post-match drinks, halftime. It meant seats in the directors section. I mean, they're arguably the best seats in the house. And after a while, it became clear to me that I was, quote, I was the American, or I was the Yank.
Yes, because Americans back then didn't know what West Ham was.
No, years later, this is after the book came out. Book came out in 86, probably around 1990, 92. I was walking up the back stairs to get into the director's room with an American friend of mine I was taking to the match. And there were 2 of the stewards who were walking down. One of them stopped on a landing and said, "How are you, Chuck?" And I forgot his name now, but I knew it then. And as they left us, the other steward asked, he said, "Who's that?" And he said, "Oh, that's the Yank that wrote the book." And I thought it might be the biggest compliment I've ever had about something I've written.
And so the new owners have stopped inviting you over. That's when it stopped, was when they took over?
No, I don't think that's really fair.
Just curious.
They didn't stop. I just never had a way to get in touch with them.
I see.
And I have a couple of people who know them who have mentioned them to me. And it's a kind of dicey situation. I don't want to ask them. On the other hand, if I really wanted to go, I would ask them. So I just have gone to matches with friends there. I haven't been to the new stadium.
I haven't.
I do have, by the way, I was going to wear it, but it's too hot. They had a special limited 1-year set of available sweatshirts and shirts that were celebrating the last year at the Boleyn.
Right.
And so I have the sweatshirt, which has a kind of photographs of great events at West Ham. I'm convinced over the years that I made the right choice in the club that I chose. I mean, I have a couple of English friends who have written the best academic books about football. One is Tony Mason. It's called Association Football and English Society, 1860 to 1914. It's a wonderful book. Well, when I went to meet Tony for the first time, he asked me what I was doing, and I told him about West Ham. He said, well, if you're really interested in where football matters, it's not London. You should go to Liverpool or Newcastle. And didn't have the heart to tell him. He's right, by the way. Somebody should do a cultural history of Newcastle, Newcastle United. I've lived in London on and off. I've been in Newcastle. I've been in Manchester. I've been in Liverpool. I want to live in London.
Absolutely.
That's that simple. And consequently, that's where the book was going to have to be done.
Yes.
The other thing, since I mentioned Tony, there was a review in some prominent historical journal probably 15 years ago. Tony was doing a lengthy review of what he thought were the major books dealing with football. And when he got around to mine, which he likes, by the way, he said, somehow an American academic, Chuck Korr, charmed his way into West Ham United and got them to give him something that no English academic had gotten, which are, by the way, not only did they give me permission to use their minute books and their accounts, they let me send in somebody to microfilm them.
Oh, yeah. Now, the detail in here is remarkable. I mean, it's really, I have never seen anything like this written about. I don't know that I've read a lot of books about other clubs, but I haven't seen anything like this written about any other club. It's just, I mean, it's incredible, the level of detail you get into in terms of the conversations the board members had with each other, the actual financials of the time, which are, sort of comical now that we look back, and they talk about, we got £1,000 line of credit from a bank, and it seems very, important and sort of, it's going to tide the club over, and particularly during the world wars when they were trying to survive in a global crisis, but also a financial crisis at a much smaller level for the club. The level of detail is tremendous. And you met some people. You've told me you met some people. It's remarkable. You met somebody, I think, who played in the 1923 Cup final.
Jimmy Ruffle was his name. He was born in 1900, so he was a 23-year-old. He was 78 when I first met him. He was in great form. He retired someplace on the South Coast. Went out to interview him and want to know what it was like being a part of the club and what it was like once they got to the Cup final. Remember nobody knows how many thousands of people were on the pitch before that match started.
It could have been 200,000 people.
And he said that they were down in the dressing room and this is the biggest match of their lives and nothing's happening. And finally somebody from the Palace, not Crystal Palace, by the way, Buckingham Palace, came down and said, His Majesty is getting quite anxious. Isn't it time to start? So the players dutifully went up, and the stewards and the police pushed the crowd far enough so they bordered the pitch. But that meant if somebody was trying to take a corner, they would back up, and then he'd be kind of catapulted ahead. Well, they lost.
Right.
But, not only did I get to see him then, he used to come to matches. His son would bring him. So we would talk then. Well, thanks to a wonderful fluke, I was in London in 1980. I was there on a quasi-business thing for 4 days. And I was going to fly home the week before the FA Cup final, and I asked the airline, is it okay? I'll be part of the group, but can I stay an extra week? And they said, fine. So I called Eddie, and he provided a ticket for me. And before the match started, Jimmy Ruffle, who was sitting directly in front of me, stood up to wave to the crowd. The match, it wasn't only that they won, it was the way in which they did it. I mean, totally unexpected. You can't see it. If I back up, you probably can. Have you seen the T-shirt that has all the members of the 1980 Cup final on it?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't. That's if you stand, we might be able to see it.
There they are.
Fantastic! Oh, that's awesome. I have not seen that. That's great.
Well,
And you were at that match. You were at the
I
match.
was at the match,
Yeah.
and then actually Eddie and John Lyle, who was the manager, who was a dear man. I will never forgive Len Kearns for the way he treated John when he sacked him. They asked me if I would come to the dinner that night, the celebratory dinner at a very nice restaurant in the West End. And who can say no to that?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And the other invitation I had, and I did say no to it because I thought I would be out of place and people would say, well, who is this guy? And what? They were in an old omnibus, open top, going through East London, and they asked me if I would like to be on that. And no. There is a time at which you have to say that you don't belong. I mean, if I were a dedicated fan, I would have said, "Who the hell is this guy?"
Right. Well, it's their time. It's their time.
Yeah. And other than that, I mean, just very quickly, some of the sort of fringe benefits of it. I met a writer named Michael Jackson, who was one of the founders of the Campaign for Real Ale, had written arguably the best guide to malt whiskeys. I met him at a theater in London.
He was the beer hunter.
Yes.
Yes, and he passed away 3-4 years ago, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was familiar with his work.
He came to St. Louis.
Yeah.
And asked me someplace he wanted to go here, so I set it up. And he ended up writing a long column, I think it was in the Evening Standard, which starts out about this green automobile with the plates WHUFC makes its way through the leafy suburbs of St. Louis, and that got some notice for it. But also, somebody else did a brief story in the Evening News about, again, I can't emphasize too much how much the fact that I was an American got me the kind of entree and notice that other people might not have gotten. Anyhow, the writer there did an article about this Yank, and he said, if people want to get in touch with you, what phone number can they use? Well, I had a friend who ran the University of California Press that had published my first book. They had an office in London, and I just gave them his number, and he and his secretary, basically a 3-person operation, said they didn't mind taking calls for me. And there was one that was just quite remarkable. It was from somebody who lived, if you walk down Green Street away from you get out of the underground,
right,
and instead of taking a right to go to the bowling, take a left, walk down two streets or so, and then take a right turn on any street, and you're going to find the quintessential East London terraced homes.
Right, absolutely.
And this guy called me and said he's been a fan for close to 50 years, and he has a couple of other friends who are almost that long time. Could I come out for Sunday dinner? And that started a relationship that lasted for the better part of 15 years. And they wanted to talk about what the club meant to them. They put me on to other people. Arthur Clarke was his name, and Arthur was this incredibly soft-spoken gentleman, really loved the club, loved his home. You would have paid no attention to him whatsoever unless you knew something about him. Got around to asking him the kind of typical, what did you do during the war?
Right.
He was a bomb disposal man. And literally more than 50% of the people he trained with didn't survive the war.
Wow.
And he would just kind of mention that in passing. And then there was a great show on public television, a BBC show called UXB, Unexploded Bomb. And he sent me the book about that, and with a little note, this has brought back memories of him. But I got some remarkable insights that you can't get from the club about what it means to be a supporter, what it means. And they would constantly, the pronoun they would use in describing the club, it was always we. It wasn't they, it was we. Even when they were talking about some really stupid thing the board did, it was always, then it was they, but other than that, it was we. Yeah. And there were a number of people like that I got to meet because somebody would pass me along to somebody else. Um, that quote I told you about Tony Mason saying I charmed my way in. It ain't charm, but it's pretty close to being true. I am convinced that my accent opened the doors for me for two reasons. One, as a non-Englishman, they assumed I had no vested interest in trying to make them look bad or trying to.
Point. Yeah.
And the second is that and I don't know. There's probably a politer way to phrase this, but they were somewhat bemused by the fact that a professor, let alone an American professor, was interested in the story of West Ham United. And after all, they are not Manchester United. They are not Liverpool. They're not the Arsenal.
Right.
But it was a good story to be told. And one of the things the club did for me, they did a lot for me. And by the club, I'm basically talking about Eddie Chapman.
Yeah.
There are very few people I've ever met who became closer friends. I mean, I would go out there for dinner on a periodic basis. I knew their kids. I met their grandchildren. About once every couple of years, Eddie would give me a box of 25 Havanas that somebody had given him. It was just things like that. But when he wanted to talk about it, he knew that I was going to deal with it honestly. I did a couple of things from the very beginning that I thought were quite smart. I went out of my way not to talk to any of the current playing staff.
Yes.
I want anybody to be able to think that this was a fan or this was a jock sniffing enterprise.
Right.
And the best example, and luckily I stopped there. I was having tea one afternoon with Eddie. This is when I was there for 6 or 8 weeks in the autumn. So I finally got to go to matches. And he said, "How's it going?" And I told him, I said, "By the way, had a very interesting conversation. Somebody stopped me in the hallway. The West Ham offices, by the way, at Upton Park, they probably, the office for the secretary, the manager's secretary, they were about the size of a relatively large master bathroom. I mean, they operated very close to one another."
Yeah.
And so I said to Eddie, somebody stopped me in the hall last week and wanted to know how things were going. So I told him, we talked a bit. And he said, "Who was it?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Well, what did he look like?" So I told him, he said, "You haven't met Ron Greenwood yet?"
Oh my goodness.
I said, "No." And he said, "Well," I said, "Yeah, I guess I have." So I decided, since we had this conversation in the hallway, I would knock on Ron's door. And I got to know a couple of reporters who had covered the club for years. And I told one of them about the interview I'd done with Ron, where he talked, amongst other things, about his own values, what was wrong with the country, what was right with the country, what was wrong with football. And this guy looked at me and said, "I've covered Greenwood since the day he got to this club. You found out more about him in 2 hours than I have in 6 or 7 years."
Well,
I mean,
you were the exotic outsider, right? It's
yes,
like
exactly.
people will make confessions to strangers that they won't make to their friends.
Yes.
People will talk to the American professor when they don't necessarily maybe trust the English journalist or reporter. What was Ron Greenwood like? What was it like to sit down and spend time with him?
Well, actually, it was much better than I thought it would, because he did have this reputation. I think taciturn might describe it. First of all, I didn't want to talk about football, but he did. But he wanted me to talk about football.
Yeah, when you talked on the phone, you mentioned that he asked you kind of how you thought the club was doing, how you thought the matches were going, and your response was, I don't know.
I've seen 3 matches in my life, Ron.
Right.
He said, no. He said, "Look, you've watched enough sports, and you can tell what." So I just described what I thought had gone well, and I said, "I can understand." He said, "You're going to laugh at this, but I can understand football if I turn it into horizontal basketball." And he said, "That's not strange at all." He said last summer he had been in Seattle on vacation, somebody introduced him to Lenny Wilkins, the coach of the Supersonics, and he went to their practices and adopted some of their drills for West Ham. And he said the problem is that too many people want to make football too complicated. This is what I think of as Greenwood's rules. He said that it's a simple game. Two things. You make space for yourself and you close off space to the other team. That's football. Now you can do it in a myriad of ways. I mean, in the same way, I took a couple of Americans who had never been to a football match. I took them to Upton Park. And about 15 minutes into the match, the guy who was a huge baseball fan leaned over and said, who's number, I guess it would have been number 10, I think. Trevor Brooking's number in it.
Yes.
And I said, well, why? I told him who. He said, well, why? He said, it's just like Joe DiMaggio. I said, what do you mean? Well, DiMaggio was famous for never having to dive for a ball. Somehow a fly ball or a line drive hit in center field would find him.
Right.
He had this innate sense of where to be and when to get there. And Brooking, who everybody said he couldn't run, he couldn't jump, all he could do was play an immaculate game. Kevin Keegan, who played with him in the England squad, said Brooking was the only player he ever played with who never broke a sweat. But he was always there. And then I basically tried that out on John Lyle when he became manager. And he said, yeah, that's what the game is all about. There's certain people, you don't teach Trevor Brooking how to do that.
Right.
He's born with it. But most of what I did, almost all of it, with the exception of Lyle and Greenwood, everybody I interviewed at some length were people who had played for West Ham at one time. And the main group were ones who were there in the 1950s when they finally got promoted.
Right.
And they also created what people thought of as the West Ham way of playing, where you play with the ball rather than afraid of it.
Yes.
Even that, I talked to Ernie Gregory, who was the goalkeeper for a long time, and then was with the club for, I think, 52 years as a scout. And he was half a generation older than Malcolm Allison, Franco Farrell, Ken Brown, all those, the ones who were playing the new football. And they were, I forget who they were playing, and Ken Brown and Noel Cantwell are throwing hitting these little dinky passes in front of goal. And Gregory finally said, kick the goddamn ball away, will you?
You know, we had, I talked to Ken Brown's son, Kenny, who also played for West Ham, in the late 80s, early 90s. Kenny did a show on Memorial Day with me, and it was a pleasure talking to him. And he mentioned his dad, and I mentioned that I was talking to you, so I knew you had a connection there. But yeah, you told me some great stories about Malcolm Allison and Franco Farrell, and sort of they would get together at restaurants and use salt and pepper shakers to come up with tactics, and Allison was sort of the ringleader, and O'Farrell was kind of the quiet, follower.
Noel Cantwell, who went on to captain Manchester United, he was part of that group. And he had a very simple comment about Franco Farrell. He was the only man that Malcolm couldn't bully. And he would just Malcolm would try and push him around. He would just kind of stare at him and say, no, Malcolm, come down. I think, I probably told you the Malcolm Allison story, but I think it's worth repeating for your viewers. Allison was this dominant figure in changing the whole way that West Ham played. Malcolm had contempt for most managers, contempt for all directors, no matter which clubs they were with. Allison, I'm pretty sure, held the record for managing the most clubs, i.e. that meant the record for being sacked by the most different clubs.
Right.
And I wanted to interview him very badly. And I made arrangements to see him, and it got canceled. And I made arrangements to see him, it got canceled again. And finally, I made one more try. At that time, Allison was living with a woman who had a public relations agency, and she was a former Miss Universe.
Oh, wow.
And they were a stunning. Allison was a remarkably handsome man. I mean, they were a stunning couple. And she said, "You're the American that Malcolm had the interview." No, he never had. I said, "What do you mean? You're supposed to see him a couple of weeks ago." I said, "Well, he canceled it." She said, "Oh, are you free this Wednesday at 1?" I said, "Yeah." "Malcolm will be here then." Well, he showed up at 1:15, and we had a long talk, and it seemed so indicative. We had a long talk, smoking his Havanas and drinking his cognac. And I just put the microphone or put the tape recorder in front of him, and it's the perfect interview. You ask a 3-minute question, he does an 11-minute answer, because the idea is you want them to talk to you.
Absolutely.
Well, I went home to the flat that I was living in, and went up to see my landlord and have some afternoon tea. "Well, how's the work coming, Chuck?" And I said, "Well, I had a great interview with Malcolm Allison today." "Oh, can we hear it?" So I took the tape recorder out. 2 minutes into it, the tape broke. It's cassette. This is the. I mean, I worked so hard to get to see him.
This is reel to reel, right? The old.
No, this is cassette.
Oh, cassette. Okay. So
Yeah.
these were, yeah, okay. All right. So all the little tape. Yeah.
And so the next day I went down to Tottenham Court Road, one of the electronics places, gave the guy the cassette. He said, "It cost you twice as much to fix it." I said, "Well, why don't you just throw it away?" I said, "No, there's something on it." And he said, "Be ready in 3 days." So 3 days later, I went back and said, left a cassette. "Oh yeah, you're the American, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, what's an American doing talking to Big Mal?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, that is Allison, isn't it?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "You were listening?" He's what? He said, "I had to listen to it to make sure the splice worked." Well, he listened to the whole tape.
Yeah.
And I just thought that really sums up the way I did the research. I was the American who got to talk to Big Mal, and then
I don't think it would. I mean, I think the opportunity you had was one that you had that was kind of unique in time, because obviously this was at a time when football was not popular here. It was virtually non-existent in the U.S. Other than the North American Soccer League, which did have some popularity, but that didn't really bring the English game over here the way television has and the internet has in the last 10 or 15 years. I think if an American journalist went over there now, he or she would get stonewalled just like anybody else.
yes,
But going
yes.
there in the 1970s, you were the outsider, and they took you in. And I think it's a unique thing that I don't think anybody could ever reproduce. I'm not sure a football club would ever let anybody do something like this again.
I think you're probably right. I mean, certainly. Well, remember, one of the reasons, there were 2 reasons why I stopped it at 66. One was because football did change, but the other is I started the research in 75. So more or less the majority, there are very few people who would be involved in when I was doing the research who were there before 1966,
Right.
except the board. The board was there forever, and there were always Pratts and Kearnses. They were either chairman or vice chairman. One family would be chair, the other would be vice chair. I told you to remind me about Len Kearns.
I was just going to do that, as a matter of fact. Yes.
Len Kearns is hated talking publicly, really disliked it enormously. His father had been chairman for longer than anybody, and was the autocrat, was autocratic in all kinds of ways. And I tried to get Len to do an interview. And just before I was going to finish the research, he finally sat down and talked with me. He said, "Well, I can give you 20 minutes." And we did over an hour, because apparently nobody had ever made him feel at ease before. Or I think what you pointed out earlier, feel non-threatened by me.
Right.
Well, the book came out. By the way, I told you the book got done when it got done because I wanted to have a launch party.
Yes.
Well, we had the launch party in the director's area, in the boardroom at West End, and that was free, by the way. They didn't charge us for that.
That's fantastic.
But anyhow, a couple of weeks after the book came out, I went to a match, and during halftime, Len Kern said to me, "Could we talk for a bit after the match?" And I said, no, he said, "Just wanted to talk with you." He was really upset about some of the things I'd had to say about his father. But as soon as he said that he was upset, the next thing he said was, "Well, it's my fault. You can only write based on what people told you, and I should have talked more with you.
Hmm.
Oh, by the way, what can we do to help sales?" And I said, "Well, would be nice to have an article in the program about it."
Right.
He said, "Well, if you'll write it and send it to me, I'll get it to Brian Blower, who's the commercial manager, and it'll either come out over his name or it'll just come out with no author." And it ran in the program for either 2 or 3 matches. And I can't help but believe that had to help sales.
Of course it did. I'm sure it did. Absolutely.
Speaking of sales, let me give you a tale of woe, okay?
Oh, please do. Please do.
Duckworth was a perfect publisher. He spent virtually no time telling me what to do. They had a very good copy editor. The graphics did something that I'm not used to having done at university presses. The photos that are in the book are not a photo section. They're photos scattered throughout the book.
That's true. It's not. Usually, there's a section in the middle of the book, but these, as you say, these are sort of integrated right in with the pages. Yeah, which is nice. Yeah.
So they did all kinds of things that were right, and the book went through 3 paperback editions, and they finally let it go out of print. They let it go out of print in 1994. And in 1995, for the centenary of the club's motto that year was West Ham United, the club with a history. And the best history of the club was unavailable for sale in the club shop because the publisher had let it go out of print.
Oh, that is really unfortunate, and by the way, a very West Ham thing to have happen, I think.
Yes. Well, there is a new edition that came out, very limited, about someplace in the early 2000s, I think, maybe a little early. The then chairman, Terry Brown. By the way, I know there's all kinds of different views about Terry.
Yes.
He was always very nice to me. I used to go out there once a year to see him, and we would end up spending almost all of our time talking about the history of East London. He was much more interested in that, talking about that with me than he was football. Anyhow, Terry said the book should be published again. And I said, "What do you have in mind?" He said, "Well, who owns the copyright?" I said, "I do." So he said if I would sign it over to, not the copyright, but give them permission,
Right.
they would do a computerized scan of it and publish it. And the only thing they couldn't have an index in it because all the pagination was different. And it was on sale at the club shop for a year or 2, I think. I have no idea. Oh, the deal was that if they made any money off of it, I would get 20% royalties, but that would all go to Kick It Out.
Right. Which is the anti-racism.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I have no idea. I have a copy of it, but
yeah.
I have thought for a couple of years now that sometime I would like to find somebody in London who's in a position to do that kind of thing, because I think there's sales potential still in the book.
Oh, I'm sure there is. I'm sure there is. And we're part of what we want to do with American Hammers TV is talk to authors of West Ham books. We talked to Robert Banks, who wrote a book called, well, he's written 4 books about supporting West Ham.
Yeah.
And he's with a small publisher. I don't know how small it is, or I think a relatively small publisher. So we have some minimal connections with people who are involved in publishing West Ham type materials in England. We're going to work with other authors as well. So, I mean, I would love to help you in any way we can and bring it back. I think it'd be fantastic.
Well, I mean, just ask around, because I'm out of touch with the whole industry now. The West Ham was the first of 3 books dealing with sports that I've written.
That's right.
The second is a history of the Major League Baseball Players Union called The End of Baseball as We Know It. And I'm very proud of the book. It's gotten very good reviews. Wall Street Journal named it one of the 5 best baseball books. I'm not sure I would go with that, but I certainly was willing to accept it.
Wow, that's fantastic.
But that gave me a chance to develop a real friendship with Marvin Miller, who was the director of the union for years.
Yes, which a lot of our viewers are, believe it or not, a lot of our viewers are English. Probably more than half of our viewers are English. So I should probably just mention that he was the director of the Major League Baseball Players Union for a long time. He was
for English, it's his job was the equivalent of Gordon Taylor's job with the Professional Footballers Association.
Right.
And Marvin and the Players Union revolutionized all of sports in America when they got free agency, because every other sport has to try and work around that. Well, the other book, the one I'm proudest of, came out 2008. It's called More Than Just a Game, and it's about how political prisoners on Robben Island in South Africa created and used football as a way of establishing a sense of community and training themselves for the leadership who's going to take to run South Africa when democracy finally arrived.
You need to get a hold of that because it sounds fascinating. Yes, absolutely.
Well, the reason I remember, 2 reasons. One is I just wanted to tell you about it.
Right.
But the other is I told you what happened to the West Ham book right before the centenary of the club.
Yes.
I was in South Africa. HarperCollins did it in London, and St. Martin's bought the rights in America. And some good South African publisher bought the rights. And I was there during the World Cup. And I went into a bookstore in the airport in Cape Town, and they had a separate table for football books because of the World Cup. And I looked around, and my book isn't there. This is not a good thing.
Right.
So I asked the salesman, do you have a book called More Than Just a Game? He said, oh, yes, we have there's a copy over there. Would you like to look? I said, no, I actually wrote it. He said, oh, well, let me get our manager. He said, our manager is a great fan of the book. He's bought 2 or 3 copies to give to friends. So I said to the manager, why isn't it? He said, they let it go out of print about 6 months before the World Cup.
Oh. That's unbelievable. That's just like a curse. That's terrible.
So, you win a few, you lose a few.
You're right. Well, you've had another truly West Ham experience, although outside the context of the club, it's something that's just a West Ham type thing to have happen. I wanted to ask you too. I wanted to go back for a minute and talk to you a little bit about John Lyle, because I think you knew him really well.
Yes.
All of our English viewers will know him. I, of course, knew who he was, but as an American who's come to the club in the last 15 years, I wasn't really around for his era. So what was your relationship with him like?
John had a reputation, well-deserved, of being absolutely straight shooter. He was one of these people who could glare at you, and you knew what you were supposed to do. Physically, he was not particularly low. I mean, he's solid. He was a very good defender. He was considered one of the best young prospects West Ham had in years. And within his first year at the club, he broke a leg twice, and retired from football probably at age 24 or something like that. And Eddie Chapman had needed an assistant in the office. So John got his introduction into the off-the-field aspects of football by working as Eddie's assistant. And then when Ron Greenwood came, he brought him on as an assistant manager. John was one of those people that players thought they could talk to because he wasn't going to lie to them. And that would mean telling some players some very unpleasant things about themselves. But Billy Bonds, I think, was probably the perfect player for John Lyle. I mean, somebody who had some real talent, but also played at 100% all the time.
Right.
John, after did take them. There's some question as to the 75 FA Cup, who was really running the side. Ron was the titular manager. The 1980, it was definitely John Lyle's club. I mean, John used to make it a point when I would be in the directors in the boardroom after a match. The routine was John always went downstairs to talk to the players after a match. And then he would come up, and the directors liked to have him. Well, John would always find a way to slip away and just sort of, and come on, let's talk. And I mentioned one match in 1977. It was the last. It was a Monday after the season was technically over, and West Ham conceivably could have been relegated.
Right.
But it would have made life a lot easier if they won that match. They were playing Manchester United. It was cold. It was rainy. It was just unpleasant in every respect, including the fact that Man United scored in the first 5 minutes. And West Ham got a penalty shortly after that and missed it.
Some things never change.
Yeah, well, they ended up winning 4-2.
Well, that changed.
Yes. And I went into Eddie Chapman's office, and he and Jack Hellier, if ever there was a man described as larger than life, Jack or his father had published every West Ham United program from 1900 to about 1980.
Wow.
And Jack, his son took over. Jack was the kind of unpaid PR man for the club. Well, Eddie and Jack and I were in this small office surrounded by cigar smoke and an open bottle of very good scotch. And I decided to go down to the boardroom. And John Lyle came in a little while afterwards, and he was surrounded by people. And after a little while, I was standing off in a corner, and John came over and said, let's talk for a while. I said, sure. He said, how are you getting back to where you're staying? I said, he said, no, if you want to wait a while, I'll drive you to another underground station. It'll be a lot easier for you to leave from there. And I said, how you doing? And he said, well, obviously it's a big win, but I got to tell you that I'm looking around this room and all these people who were telling me what a wonderful match it was and how good we were. These are the very same people who, when we were in a losing streak, didn't want to be seen with me. And he said, yeah, there are a few people around here, and you're one of them, but there are a few people around here who were kind of with me even when we were losing. And John was a real taskmaster. What he expected was 100% from everybody all the time. And if he got less than that, if there was a reason for it, he wanted to know it. And if there wasn't a reason for it, he didn't want you to invent one. Mm-hmm. And he drove out to Len Kern's home, which is out in the suburbs, I think, of Essex, to talk about the terms for his next year's contract. Now, remember, John had been with the club since he was probably 16. I could be wrong about that, but certainly he'd come up through the youth side. And he'd been the manager for probably a decade. Yeah. And Len Kearns just said, John, we're not renewing your contract. That was it.
That was it.
That was it.
No sort of sentimental, no discussion, no negotiation, no sort of thank you for the trophies, thank you for 96, thank you for the,
I was quite struck a few years ago. Okay, there's a Bobby Moore stand, there's Trevor Brookings stand. Now in the new stadium there's also a Billy Bond stand.
Right.
But I went to, I think, 2 matches West Ham their last season at the Bull-Inn. And I looked down, and the entranceway to the stadium is named after John Lyle. And I wonder whether they've carried that over to the new stadium, but my immediate reaction was, well, it took them a damn long time.
Yeah, too long.
But his son, some of his family were there when they had this dedication, and I'm sure it meant a lot to them.
Well, I'm sure you've seen the clip of after he died, West Ham had a home match. I think it was against Wolves, and it was the next match after his death. And there was supposed to be a minute of silence, and during the minute of silence, somebody started the Johnny Lyle's Claret Blue Army song chant, and it went on and on and on and on and on and on. It was a wonderful tribute to him.
Yeah.
And there's been a movement, I know. I've seen some movement online on social media to actually name the last stand in the Olympic Stadium after John Lyle. So you'd have, Brooking Bonds, Bobby Moore, and then John Lyle. Obviously whether they'll happen or not, I have no idea. That's a fans movement, so whether it'll trickle up, who knows? And how an Olympic Stadium that's oval has stands, I'm not sure anyway.
Well, the only thing that I find a little bit troubling about that, as I said, I was probably closer to John as a friend than anybody on the kind of playing side of it.
Yeah.
And if you dedicate something to John, what do you do about Ron Greenwood?
No, you're absolutely right, because Ron Greenwood was his mentor. Ron Greenwood won the first three trophies West Ham won out of the four we won. And Ron Greenwood was obviously the manager who presided over the players who went on to win in '66. So, I think there's a recency bias with John Lyle. I think players I think fans, who are in their 40s, 50s remember John Lyle in a way they don't remember Ron Greenwood, maybe.
Yeah.
Certainly anybody younger than that doesn't really remember either one of them all that well. So, but yes, you're absolutely right. You would want to.
The other thing about something Greenwood told me that really hit home, I forget how long he'd been at the club by the time probably more than 10 years. And he said, I'll always be the outsider. He said, I came here from Arsenal. And much as people like me and respect me, it's the ones who've come up through the ranks at West Ham. He said, there's always going to be somebody who's going to remind me that you're not really West Ham.
That's the most successful manager West Ham has ever had.
Yeah.
In terms of winning trophies. And that's an interesting, of course, all that has changed so much now. I mean, we have a foreign manager. We have a Chilean manager now. We've had managers from Croatia and from all over the world. And of course, the players come from all over the world too. But so I don't think you'd really get that attitude that much anymore. But that's interesting that he felt that way in his time, and that he didn't feel fully accepted in his time, despite being an icon of the club.
No, the relationship between him and John. I mean, one of the things that Ron made it a point to do was not be looking over John's shoulder. Earlier I mentioned Frank O'Farrell.
Yes.
And as you probably know, Frank succeeded Sir Matt Busby as the manager at Manchester United. And United gave Busby an office right down the hall from Frank's office. And if players had something they didn't like about Frank, they would get out and talk to Sir Matt about it. It was an intolerable situation.
It's impossible. You can't work in those conditions.
And there's, I've just forgotten his name. The former player who's gone on to be a very fine author, Irishman who spent a lot of time in the first division, in the English first division. And he wrote what is regarded as the best biography of Sir Matt Busby. And he has a brief section about Frank O'Farrell in it. And I'll never forget the quote. He said, Frank O'Farrell, a man who most people agree has succeeded in football despite his basic decency.
Yes, that's very good.
And Frank, when we had the launch party, it was a kind of cold October night in London, and two friends of ours, a married couple in St. Louis, flew over just for the launch party. I mean, they were in London for 4 days, but it was for the launch party. Ann and I got there, and we went to one of the side doors. It was supposed to be unlocked, and it wasn't. And there was Frank O'Farrell standing there shivering. He had come up from Torquay to be at the launch. And I'd only seen him, I think, twice. We corresponded a lot. So he was there. Dick Walker, who was the captain of the club right after World War II, down to the late 50s, he was there. There were a sort of strange collection of people because, as I mentioned to you on the phone last week, some of the interviews you'll see in the book are not the kinds of things you would imagine would be in a book about football. Maybe that's another thing that makes the book bizarre. There were people that I wanted to talk to. One of them, who was quoted briefly in the book. Uh, does the name Arthur Hopcraft mean anything to you?
Sure. It's in there somewhere. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Hopcraft was a football journalist who ended up having he got what is it agoraphobia? That's fear of crowds, and
Yes, agoraphobia. Yes.
well, he suffered from that for a while. He became a prize-winning playwright. Some of his stuff on long plays on BBC won all kinds of awards.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But he also was the author of what a couple of English friends told me, a couple of people in football, and they're right. It is arguably the best book I've ever read about football. It's called The Football Man. You can still find a copy someplace. It's a set of essays that's subtitled People and Passion in Football. It is just superb. And there's also a quote in it, and I'll come close to getting it right, that I used to use in class when I'd start a class and people would want to know, well, what can you learn from sports? And Hopcraft says that there are those people who fearfully say about football, after all, it's only a game. It has not been only a game since the Victorian working class took it away from the middle class and turned it into their own. What happens on the pitch doesn't only matter there. It affects the sensibilities, it affects the passions. It's not like food, but it affects some people the same way alcohol does. It engages the emotions. I said I butchered the quote up, but you get the general point.
No, I do. I do.
And it's there's no single book about football that I keep telling people if they're really interested in the sport, that's the book you should go read. It's been out of print for a long time, but I'm sure you can find a copy.
Absolutely. And what I wanted to mention too, because I have to wrap up before too long. Unfortunately, I do these shows from my attic. And our godson is staying with us for a few days, and he needs to go to sleep.
So you've stolen his bed for?
I've stolen his bedroom. I have. So this is the book, and I got this on Amazon, so I know it's out of print, but it's still available, readily available. But this is the famous dust jacket. You're the first author to ever wear your dust jacket. There it is.
There it is.
There it is.
Trust me, the reason I'm holding it up, there's no way I can fit into it now.
And that's from '86, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, this is '86.
Yes.
I think it was Walford who was number 3 most of the year.
Yes, from the greatest season West Ham ever had in the top flight of English football.
Yes. And I would like to take some credit for that, but I can only go so far.
So the cover of the book, just by way of explanation, is a photograph of that shirt.
That is the shirt they photographed.
And it's the one you were holding just now.
Yes.
So you're the first author, probably the first author ever to wear his own dust jacket.
Yes.
I think that's fantastic. And you still look out for the results of the club? Do you watch the games on TV? I mean, how are you?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, the most people, virtually everybody who finds out about the book, assume that I wrote a book about West Ham because I'm a West Ham supporter.
Right.
And it's just the opposite. I became a West Ham supporter because I did the research and because I wrote the book. Actually, the first football match I ever saw was the World Cup, 1966 World Cup on television. I and 2 other people at the University of Santa Clara went into the faculty club at 7 in the morning on a Saturday to watch this. And then about 3 months later, Ann and I moved to London. Mm-hmm. And I was going in every day to either the British Museum or the Public Records Office. And I was reading the newspaper the same way you read it. I read it here, which is back to front. You read the sports section first.
Of course.
And I thought, well, I had to pick a team to root for because you got to have a rooting interest so you really get involved. Yeah. You want to guess who I supported?
You told me. You've already told me, so I'm not going to guess. But yes, go ahead. Tell us.
Well, it was Tottenham.
Right.
Because as a historian, I was just bemused by somebody called Hotspurs.
Right.
And they won the FA Cup that year. So I remained a Spurs supporter. I never told anybody at West Ham about that.
That's probably a good idea.
And and so it's not until I started working at West Ham, I started actually going to the ground in the summer of '74 or '5, and then saw my first match in the autumn of '76. Got to go to the two cup finals, '75 and '80. Eddie Chapman did something remarkably nice for me. He gave me a ticket for the '80. So I sat with his family. He let me buy two tickets, and two of my dearest friends. One is a historian named Willie Lamont, one of the leading historians of the 17th century, who was a fanatic Arsenal supporter.
Ah, okay.
The other was somebody who was my mentor and who'd been Willie's undergraduate advisor, historian named S.T. Bindoff, who was the great historian of Tudor England. And I discovered that he liked football, but he never went because nobody ever thought of asking this august professor, who was also 6'6" and terrified people. So I said to him, "How'd you like to come to matches with me?" And he said, "I've always been interested in West Ham. I've probably never told you this, but I went to the 1923 Cup final." He was 14 at the time.
That's amazing.
And his boyhood hero was, of all people, Jimmy Ruffle. So I got to introduce the two of them. But most of all, these two generations of historians, neither of whom had ever thought of going to a football match with the other one, went to the 1980 Cup final, courtesy of my being able to buy a couple of tickets from West Ham United. I owe a great number of things to the club, but it was the chance to do something like that is pretty well high on the list. And as you pointed out, it's impossible to imagine any club doing now what West Ham let me do then.
I don't know that any club would do it, to be fair. I don't know that the current West Ham board would do it, but I think, as you say, I think that's true of any club. Everything is so controlled by public relations now, and by gatekeepers, and by who are trying to control the message and spin the message at all times and protect executives and control access. And believe me, I know this as a former journalist in the tech industry. It was the same way.
Mm-hmm.
We had to go through layers and layers and layers of people to finally get to some executive who wouldn't tell us anything anyway. So that's the way it is in football now too. It maybe even be worse. It's just, to me, it's just wonderful that you had this sort of moment in time where you're able to take advantage of this incredible sort of offer to come in and just do whatever you wanted. And it produced a great result. And again, I don't think there'll ever be another book like this. I just don't think it's possible.
Well, I cannot tell you, maybe I shouldn't even try then, just how much I've enjoyed this conversation. I hope we have another one, not on camera soon.
Oh, listen, I absolutely want to keep in touch.
And the other thing is, I have very, very good memories of the whole process that went into the creation of the book. Look, I've gone on to two totally different things since then. I mean, this is based in East London. The Union book got me to New York City to do the research. And the Robben Island book meant that Ann and I got to go over every couple of years to spend time in the most beautiful city in the world, which I think Cape Town is. But West Ham is special to me for a couple of reasons. One is because the people I knew there, none of whom were still around, but also it was my introduction to showing myself, if not just, not also, but showing myself that I really could turn myself into a professional academic historian of sport. When I'll sort of end it with this and show you, how good I feel about the book.
Yes, of course.
When I first decided to work on the history of sport, I am sure, I mean, as positive as I can be, that I would not have had the courage to do it if I already didn't have tenure.
Oh, I don't doubt that at all.
Because I had a dean who would...
my wife is a PhD, so I have some understanding of how the world works. So, yeah.
Well, the dean every once in a while would say, "Well, you ever going to get around to doing real history again?" And my then department chair said, "Well, you can have fun with that, but nobody's ever going to take you seriously again as a historian." And trust me, I've been taken a lot more seriously than he ever was.
I'm sure. I don't doubt it at all. I think
But
that's
you sort of start out with, and then I'll let you go. I mean,
fine.
look at it. My experience in doing this kind of stuff goes from Jackie Robinson to Marvin Miller to one day I went over to somebody's house in Pretoria. He said, we're going to have some of the guys up for Sunday braai, barbecue, and we can talk about Robben Island. I said, sure. Well, by the time we started the meal, there were 14 guys sitting around a table with my tape recorder in the middle. And of those between those 14, I figured they had served roughly 240 years in prison as political prisoners. Now, how do you open a conversation with that? So,
I don't know.
Those are the kinds of advantages that this whole thing has brought me.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh no, it's fantastic. It's just, I very much want to keep in touch with you, and I want to let you know that if you and Ann come to Boston, well, I live about 30 miles north, but the attic is open. We have a huge finished attic. We have a nice king size bed. You're welcome to stay with us. Swim in our pool. Spend as much time as you want. My godson goes home tomorrow, so you can come tomorrow if you want to. But no, in all seriousness, it's been wonderful getting to know you. It's been wonderful talking to you here. I hope we can do another show on camera sometime, but even if we don't, I'd like to keep in touch because it's just been a fantastic experience getting to know you.
I enjoyed it. No, I'll tell you, you can do two things for me. We live in a kind of open plan house. I'm on the third floor, Ann's on the second floor. I don't know how much of this she's been able to hear. My guess is a pretty good share of it. Could you send the way I saw the show you did a couple weeks ago, by the way,
yes.
The one you sent me the link for. If
yes.
you could do the same thing with this.
Oh, of course.
Send me the link. But also, this will be on YouTube sooner or later, right?
It'll be on YouTube within the next hour.
Oh, okay. And I was supposed to remind you. Could you send me either a link, an email, or a phone for the people in St. Louis?
Oh yeah, I'll get in touch with them. Absolutely. Yeah.
When the book came out, about a couple of months after the book came out, Ann and I were driving down a major street in St. Louis, and a guy pulls up alongside me. He says, "Is that West Ham United?" I said, "The license plate." I said, "Yeah." Light change. Pull up to the next red light. He says, "There's a new book out about West Ham." I said, "Yeah, I wrote it. Go buy it."
There's a St. Louis supporters group. I don't remember where they meet. They meet in one of the local bars. There's a guy, Brawley, in St. Louis, who is one of the hosts of the American West Ham podcast, which is really good, by the way. Really good. He and Tony from Pennsylvania do that together. And then we have had another supporter on from St. Louis, whose name I don't remember at the moment, but I sent you the link with the interview. Another really good guy. I'm sure they'd be happy to hang out and talk about the club and just, hear all the stories you just told me. They could, I'm sure you got a lot more you could tell them in person. So yeah, I will get in touch with those guys and I'll let them know that you'd like to chat with them. I think that would be great. That's really one of the reasons we're here. That's what we want to do. So
if you could also send me a link to the podcast you say that they do.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Brawley just did a great episode with a former Premier League referee. Very much worth about 2 hours worth, including him admitting to making a mistake that cost West Ham 2 points against I'm going to forget who it was. Anyway, recently in the last couple of years. Anyway, good interview, good show of the podcast. So I'll send you that as well.
Okay, take care.
I just before we go, I just wanted to say, if you hang on for half a second, I'm going to stop our recording. If you hang on for half a second, we can go. But before we stop, what the viewers are going to see here, Chuck, Dr. Charles Korr, thank you so much for doing this. I've been looking forward to this. The day Tim said to me, "Let's start a YouTube channel," for American West Ham fans, I said, we have to talk to Charles Korr. He wrote the book. So this has been very exciting for me. I've really enjoyed it. And I will, we'll have this. This is going to run. People are going to think it's live, even though it's not. That's kind of how we do it with the Skype videos. But it'll be in our archive, hopefully for eternity. And I really want to thank you for this.
Oh, thank you. It's been great fun, and it's not very often you get a chance to. I mean, the book is what 43 years old now.
Yes.
No, 33 years old now.
30. I was gonna say I don't think I'm quite that old, although I'm older than that. Yeah, I'm a lot older than the book.
So haven't talked to many people about the book. Haven't talked to many people who read the book. Let's put it that way.
All right, hang on just a second. We're gonna
Okay.
sign off, and then I'll talk to you for a second.